I think it's helpful and even healthy as a nation in this case to examine those moments with a finer tooth comb and really pull out all of the messy bits and talk about them and imagine them, because more often than not, if history does make us who we are, then a lot of the unsavory elements that we see and deal with and are reckoning with in Canadian society can also be traced back to those moments.
I'm Nathan Maharaj. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is Kai Thomas, author of the new novel In the Upper Country, which takes place in a fictional Canadian town called Dunmore, a place where people fleeing slavery in the southern United States build new lives. Kai Thomas, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Thanks for having me.
To start out our discussion about In the Upper Country, tell me, what is the Upper Country?
I came to that title because I was intrigued by, I guess, the layered meanings in that term. It was a term that I encountered in some historical documents, and I think it's still around to some extent for today. It references, especially in the era of the fur trade, the country upriver, since that was probably the most important way to locate things in reference to each other, since the rivers were really important trade routes, obviously. So it refers to that. It also, I like the way that it hinted at the idea of Canada as this destination for the Underground Railroad, not only as being northerly from the US, but as having the moral superiority associated with being the promised land in that chapter of history. So yeah, the title kind of plays with all of those meanings as they relate to the different themes and historical moments in the novel.
Can you tell me about the town of Dunmore? Who lives there? Some of these characters we meet at the start and how they come to be there?
Yeah, absolutely. Dunmore was my way of paying homage, I guess, and creating a town that didn't exist but perhaps could have existed, kind of a composite of the many towns that emerged in some cases during this period of time after the fugitive slave law had been passed in the US in 1850. Between that time and abolition in the United States, which about 1865. So there's this 15-year period where Canada was the destination of the Underground Railroad. And a number of these towns emerged, many of which did not survive the test of time, and there's many reasons for that. But Dunmore was my attempt as a writer to imagine what one of these towns could have looked like, what it could have, the types of work that people would have been engaged in, the types of politics that people would have been having conversations about and engaged in, and that's what it represents.
Mm. You mentioned the political context, the fugitive slave law that created such a push for folks to flee and get well clear of the arm of that law. Is that why you set it then in 1859, which is just sort of as the tensions are reaching a boiling point that would ultimately tip the United States into civil war?
Yeah, I think that moment of pre-Civil War in the United States was significant. I think it was kind of far enough into this era where Canada had become the destination, the most important destination of the Underground Railroad, that what I imagine that what that would have meant for the culture and the societies of these towns would have been significant, in that they would have been entrenched they would have staked their claim to a certain degree in and amongst the society that they were situated in. And um, and yeah, as you're alluding to, this the way in which that particular moment, that particular year precipitated these uh, really dramatic events. And so the I was interested in the way that all of the factors that contributed to this boiling point that you're talking about in the US might have been felt in Canada. And at the same time, the book ventures through memory, through recorded history, earlier in time. And it seemed like a good anchor point to go back and forth from.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the newspaper that's run out of Dunmore. The character Arabella is its publisher, and she enlists another character, Lincinda, as a journalist who writes for it. The paper's called The Colored Canadian. Was that based on a real publication or a set of publications that you sort of turned up in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. There are several Black newspapers that were published in the era, mostly in Southern Ontario, and one of which was founded by a woman named Marianne Shadd Carey, who lived in Buxton, which is one of the few Underground Railroad era towns that survives to this day. They have a very vibrant Emancipation Day festival and community life in general. So Marianne Shadd Carey was involved in starting a newspaper called the Provincial Freeman, I believe. So I just thought it was so interesting, and I believe she is recognized as the earliest female uh, publisher of a Black female publisher of a newspaper. So Arabella's character hints at her life in some ways, and I was just interested in the impetus to for Black folks at that time and in that place to write. I was interested in the things they would have been writing about and the discourse that newspapers such as that created. And I think for the purposes of the novel, I don't spend a lot of time, showing scenes of what the newspaper was, both in terms of the actual publishing and the writing of it, but it's served kind of almost as a foil
Mm.
to go deeper into what conversations were happening behind these articles and what dynamics uh, were prompting the types of articles that were being written
Mm.
and stuff like that. So that's a bit about that choice.
Were you tempted to blow it up and kind of almost do like a John Dos Passos kind of thing and bring in the newspaper and start and really push the limits of what can be in the novel? Give us sections of the newspaper, or was it always going to? Did you go in knowing I'm using this for background and this is like propulsive fuel? This is not this. I'm not going to invite this into center stage.
I think there was a moment where I wanted to, give sort of like uh, facsimile. Is that the word? I want to imitate what the articles that I was finding in the records would have been talking about.
Hmm.
I think I shied away from that initially because it's really hard to do so. Historical fiction is kind of interesting because, or at least in the way that I learned to write it in this book, in that you're you're conjuring, you're trying to conjure an era and a way of speaking and all of these things. You're trying to conjure a world that is past, but inevitably, you, it doesn't really work when you do it really well, because you read through some of these newspaper articles or some primary source material from the mid 1800s, and as close as it is to modernity, the way that people formulate ideas is like so different, was so different. And the way that people speak was so different to the extent that I found if I were to try and imitate that, I don't know if it would be as readable. And, I think that I was going for a form of realism, a form of historical realism, but I still wanted it to be easeful to a degree for people to engage with the dialogue, with the writing in general, the prose in general.
Mm.
And so it's just that middle ground that you have to get to where you're summoning the world without fully imitating it.
Arabella runs the newspaper, I think, speaking to exactly what you were saying before, which is with a sensibility that I think doesn't quite register for us. She's got an explicitly political aim with the newspaper. There's writing that she has in mind for persuading or reinforcing the views of her intended audience to support the cause of emancipation. I mean, you couldn't have more skin in the game than a political agenda like that as a publisher. What did you learn about sort of journalism in that time that someone like Lucinda might be doing, with respect to how widespread literacy would be, how one would learn to read and write, and how that would affect who you conceive of as your audience?
I think what you're hinting at there is a key element that I noticed right away, and that probably most people would notice if you begin to read newspaper articles from that period is, yeah, the expectations of journalism were quite different. It was often very didactic, very partisan, very very, very political in that way, where there wasn't necessarily, and I'm not an expert on this, it's just, one of the things that I noticed. And I think from what I have read and heard, it kind of goes across the board, whether you're looking at publications such as the New York Times back in the day, or the Quebec Gazette was one that I read a little bit of as well. But yeah, it has that quality to it, which I thought was interesting. And obviously, as you're pointing out, there's a very clear and even arguably moral impetus to do so, to write in a way that perhaps sounds a bit more like propaganda than what we would recognize as journalism. So that's a thing for sure. Many of the smaller publications, from what I read, were not actually successful in the long term. I imagine part of that was because of the struggle of literacy, paired with perhaps struggle of funding, financing.
Mm-hmm.
The newspaper, as I depict it in the book, is quite successful. That was me kind of stretching a little bit in order to create a dynamic that I thought would be interesting and not too far off of what actually happened to disrupt the genre and what I was trying to do there. I think, yeah, the point around literacy is an interesting one. How I tried to engage with that in the novel was at hinting that at the very least the endeavor of producing written work in a regular way, such as in the newspaper, would be all, paired with the endeavor of a community that is coming out of a context where it would have been not only illegal but extremely dangerous to read and to practice reading, and thus for the newspaper and for literacy more generally to be this source of and this site of power in a community such as that.
I've read, and I think you write in the afterword of the book, that there's a historical figure named John Daddy Hall that you learned about in your research. You ultimately decided not to fictionalize Hall's life and to sort of set him aside. But can you tell me about him? What was so interesting about John Daddy Hall?
Yeah, he has a fascinating story. A lot of what I learned about John Daddy Hall, I have to shout out the historian Peter Myler, um, based in Toronto, actually, or near thereabouts. And he just had this fascinating life. And when I read about it, I initially came across a photo, a portrait of his image, which was interesting in and of itself, given the period and the fact that in the mid 1800s, this would have been this is the beginning of photography and the first time that Black folks or marginalized people generally could represent themselves in that way, whereas previously portraiture would have been relegated to the elites. So it was interesting already, and it's a powerful photograph. But the information on his life that kind of followed was just blew me away. In a brief summary, he was he was a man of African as well as indigenous descent. He fought in the War of 1812 for Tecumseh, who was the Shawnee indigenous leader and kind of visionary, and was subsequently enslaved for many years in the American South, escaped, and eventually was one of the founding members of the Black community of Owen Sound, which was considered the northern terminus of the Underground Railroad at the era. And he lived to be like 115 years old, according to reports, which is a little bit dubious in that time frame, given the lack of birth records and whatnot. But fact is, he was extraordinarily old, and so just had this like this life that touched on all these chapters and points in history that I've seen represented to a certain extent, but large parts of I hadn't seen, and I was inspired to learn more about them. And as you mentioned, initially I had conceived of the book as following John Daddy Hall's story very closely, and even naming him as a character. As I learned more about the genre and started reading other things and writing, I veered away from that largely because I was just struck by the sacredness of a person's actual name, and not did not feel that it was appropriate to presume to write scenes from a real person's life, and felt like if I'm going to write fiction, let me just write fiction and allow for the possibilities that that entails. So instead, I shout him out in the acknowledgments, and I pay deep respect to him and many other people who really lived and whose lives inspired my research. And he was definitely the first and the central figure to get me thinking about these things, Black and Indigenous relations of the period, the character and the quality of these Underground Railroad communities, and things of that nature.
The character is really interesting to me in that, as you say, you pulled from that into your book, that representation of the entwinement of Black and Indigenous identity, culture, and you pulled it into the book, though I thought in a really interesting way, in a way that for me kind of signaled that I wasn't going to be able to just carry in my 21st century nice middle class politics and map them on, because it's going to be more complicated than that. Because in the book, the first Indigenous person we actually meet through dialogue first, and it's the quote unquote Indian that's accompanying a bounty hunter who is sort of the center of the action of the novel. And I took that as a warning to I'm going to have to actually think through this, and I'm going to have to actually evaluate the moral character of everyone, and there will be no convenient coding of identity and morality here. I am going to have to listen hard to everyone's story.
Right.
Am I making more work for myself than you intended, or is that a complication that you were really setting out for the reader?
I do the same thing. I think writing about history, there's different rules, there's different norms, different mores, all of these things. As I think generally, coming from an identity of an oppressed group, I felt there's often an impulse to romanticize in ways that I would like to imagine. I would like to have imagined that, anybody who's ever been oppressed automatically aligns themselves with somebody else, another group or another person who has been oppressed, and we can, band together and all of these things. And I think there are plenty of examples of historical alliance between groups such as Black and Indigenous folks. There's also plenty of examples of historical antagonism, and there's many reasons for that. But yeah, I think it definitely was intentional. It was a push to against romanticizing, because I think fundamentally romanticizing is a form of stereotyping, and I think the history is complex and layered and messy, and I definitely wanted to represent that in the storytelling while still shedding light on scenes and sites of power and of alliance in some cases that I hope are rendered realistic by the nuance.
Part of that nuance that I thought was really one of the strengths of the novel was that sort of problematizing of Canada. I think we're taught in as good little Canadian school kids, we're taught that Underground Railroad was this thing that we almost imagine it cartoonishly of like delivering people. Like once we snuck people across that border, they were safe because Canada didn't have slavery. Did you encounter in your research that sort of the myth making around Canada as the safe haven?
Yeah, and I think, riffing on how you kind of began this question, I encountered that in my upbringing. And I think in large part, the motivation for me to take this tact in this book of looking and unpacking a historical moment like the Underground Railroad, and similarly looking and unpacking a historical moment of the historical moment of the War of 1812. These were both things that I learned growing up in Canada as these defining moments of our national identity. You have the banding together of diverse racial and linguistic groups that was the War of 1812, and that gave us this sense of pluralism. And then you have the moral superiority and the racial tolerance of the Underground Railroad, and that also gave us these defining features. And I think, it's tricky because there is a lot of truth to both of those ideas. And as you're alluding to, that doesn't mean that that's all there was to them. And I think it's helpful and even healthy as a nation in this case to examine those moments with a finer tooth comb as we kind of brush through them and really pull out all of the messy bits and talk about them and imagine them, because more often than not, if history does make us who we are, then a lot of the unsavory elements that we see and deal with and are reckoning with in Canadian society can also be traced back to those moments, and it's helpful to do so. So,
yeah. One of the more shocking moments where you do something like that, where you sort of pull something up for examination or complication, was actually like the word or concept of slavery itself. That the word is used to describe. It's used in a fable that a character tells another. I don't want to get into spoilers. I don't want to start dropping details that give plot away. But there's almost a fable of a prince and his quote unquote brother who by the definition of their relationship in society is he's understood to be a slave, but not a slave for picking cotton and running industry. It's a very different understanding. And that was tough for me. That was a moment that felt like I felt like I was reading Cormac McCarthy, to be honest, where I was like, okay, we're gonna have to dismantle like morality and all of my like easy, like quick connections and heuristics about what's good and bad and what things mean. And I'm really gonna have to like think down to first principles of
Hmm.
what is actually going on here and what do these people mean to each other.
Hmm. I really leaned on the history books.
Mm,
And I think the complexity that you're hinting at it, that is an element where, that was no invention on my part. That is just I'm not that smart. I just I just read there's a lot that was really helpful. And I think part of what I tried to identify for this book is like, okay, I'm not a historian, I'm not a professional researcher, but
mm.
I can read and I can follow people's bibliographies, and books like Brett Rushforth, who's a historian, has this book called Bonds of Alliance that talks about slavery in the French Atlantic world. And he goes into great detail, kind of breaking down the ways that indigenous peoples in what is now Canada practiced slavery and enslavement, and really just goes into the nuance of what were the similarities, what were the differences, what did it look like, what was the material culture of it, and comparison to the French in this case. Taya Miles is a fantastic historian who wrote a book about Detroit and the ways that slavery was practiced in Detroit, called uh, The Dawn of Detroit. It's like fantastic scholarship that gets into all these nuances and these moments in history that are, yeah, difficult to understand from our perspectives, in part because of the the way we teach history of slavery and other things. We get entrenched in our own our modern understandings of things, and it's historians of that caliber who can really take a closer look and pull out how people were thinking about this at the time, which is often radically different than how we think about it today. So, so yeah, that those are some examples of how I dealt with writing those scenes or those kind of interludes in the book.
I don't want to spoil anything, but I do want to talk about this really menacing opening scene at Simeon's farm that's early in the novel, because it reminded me of something out of Quentin Tarantino, and not even just Django Unchained, just one of those scenes of like impending violence and some character who's being really polite because they intend to murder everyone if they feel they have the reason to do it.
Right.
And that tension is something I love. It's something I have to read like between my fingers. It makes me nuts. I find myself I'm putting myself in the situation. I'm trying to figure out like how far is the character away from a doorway or a weapon, and
Hmm.
what would I do, and how are you going to communicate to another person to coordinate action for like I go insane reading scenes like this. It's because the scene was so effective and I was so there and involved and like concerned for the safety of these characters and the like hidden motivations of this bounty hunter who'd
Right.
shown up literally on the doorstep. Was there a literary or cinematic archetype you were reaching for? Is this a type of scene you particularly savor, or was this like a really hard scene to write and you hated it, and I've somehow enjoyed this agonizing thing?
It's funny. I didn't think of Quentin Tarantino. I haven't thought of Quentin Tarantino until you mentioned it in terms of the association with the scene. I think the elements that you're pulling out are spot on. I'm familiar with his work. I have enjoyed some of his stuff for sure. There's probably an influence there that I hadn't even fully considered. Uh, when I was writing when I had begun in some of the earlier drafts, I read Blood Meridian, uh, which that is a book, man. I don't even know. He has a brutality and just a raw power to his writing. It was actually one of my mentors, I believe. during the process of writing Wabgishik Rice, who put me onto that book, and I I think that book in particular, if I'm thinking back to what may have influenced that scene, some of the characters, some of the ways that he builds tension around the prospect of violence in particular, and the way that you're mentioning here, I definitely tried to pull a few tips and tricks from him in that respect.
Well, it was delicious and painful. So well done.
Good. I mean, I should also mention Marlon James. I've read all of his stuff
Yeah.
since, I've been a big fan for a while,
Yeah.
and I think one of the books I read along around this time would have been his first of his latest trilogy, Black Leopard, Red Wolf.
Hmm.
He, I mean, in general, I'm really intrigued by the way he deals with violence as a theme, and as just the way that he writes it. I think he was definitely an influence in that respect. One of the things that I've heard him say in his in a talk is that something along the lines of uh, violence without aftermath is just pornography,
Hmm.
something like that.
Hmm.
And so that was an idea that I took to heart as I set about to write it, in particular because I was very aware of the ways that Black suffering will always sell and is always appealing, and that doesn't mean that that should be the focus of the work, even though Black suffering in this case is real. I think the suffering of any marginalized people, of any oppressed people, has the capacity to have that kind of pornographic element to it. And I'm using that word not in the sexual sense, but just in the sense of there being a sort of a perverse excitement around the prospect of
Hmm.
seeing this historical violence depicted and enacted. And I was very aware of that. And yeah, just wanted to make sure that number one, the ways in which I was encountering people in history books and whatever, who either were enslaved or dispossessed in some way, talk about how they were also capable of violence,
Hmm.
and talk about the ways that they needed to activate that in order to radically change their conditions, the conditions of their lives. And I was I was committed to both, trying to balance both realities, and in particular, I think the ways I was interested in depicting that dynamic, the ways that oppressed people can actually claim violence as an action for themselves,
Hmm.
you know, in a way that was not over the top or romanticized or whatever, but just going back to the history, and to these chapters of history that I was reading about, and saying, well, this and this really happened. Let me introduce that, both as a in the scenes that I'm writing, as well as in the subtext, and as a way to generate that narrative tension, because I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't seen that done a whole lot.
Hmm. This is an interesting book because it's about the Underground Railroad, but we don't spend any time uh, along that path. We don't spend time with the business of smuggling people to safety. It's not a chase novel. It's almost like the epilogue to every chase, to the story we think we know of the flight from slavery.
Yeah, I think it totally relates to the last thing that we were discussing, because my sense, in having done some reading in the genre, was that to a certain extent, that story, the story of flight, the story of violence that was experienced during enslavement, has been told.
Hmm.
and I'm not against the telling of it, uh, but I'm interested. I was interested in, yeah, holding back from going down the familiar path of what did slavery look like, how horrible it was, and going into this. It's not completely new territory. Plenty of people have done it and written about it. I just think, in the grand scheme of things, perhaps less so um, than the story of flight and of the scenes of enslavement themselves. So I was interested in, what was the aftermath? What is the aftermath? And what did it look like at this moment and at this place?
Mm.
And in what ways does that draw parallels to the present moment? And yeah, so all of that was definitely intentional. And I, for the most part, no, I didn't feel tempted to stray from
Mm.
that decision.
Mm. What kind of a reader were you when you were growing up?
I read a lot of fantasy. I listened to a lot. I remember listening to cassette tapes very young of Brian
Oh
Jakes,
yeah.
the Redwall series, The Castaways of the Flying Dutchman. I loved his work. I would listen to that a lot. I remember being, yeah, very much like drawn to the kind of action and adventure side of things. I remember loving this. I don't even know how I came across this one, but there was a series by Louis Cha is the English translation. He has this series called The Deer in the Cauldron. It's like an adventure kung fu novel series following this young kind of street urchin type named Trinket. I remember loving that. I quite enjoyed Lord of the Rings and all of the rest too, but those are some of the more niche ones that I remember
Yeah.
liking. So yeah, very drawn to that, to the fantastical as a child.
How did you start writing? Was it fanfic? Did you extend the stories of these characters that you picked up through fantastical reading, or
No, I remember one of the first things I wrote creatively that I felt really excited by was I had a history assignment at some point in high school to write about an ancestor or I don't know, remember what exactly the constraint was, but it was like either a great grandparent or something like that, some form of ancestor that that you're instructed to kind of inhabit and write about. And I just remember thinking that was so cool to do and so much fun to imagine and to read about. In part because it was a great opportunity to talk with my family, my grandparents who were then alive,
hmm.
about different people and make a decision who I wanted to write about, and then just kind of go into this uh, deep dive of a first person narration, imagining to be my great grandfather,
Hmm.
something like that. So that's one thing that I really remember as like this was a moment that I felt that this was exciting to do and enlightening to do, and I felt really drawn to that. So I think that was probably my birth as a historical fiction writer.
Do you plan to undertake more historical fiction projects in the future, or was this really a project born out of the inspiration of the research that uncovered characters like John Daddy Hall?
The next book is definitely in a similar genre,
Hmm.
and I'm at the very beginning stages of it, so it's hard to say all the ways in which it will evolve. But my sense is, you know, I want to I want to continue along this vein for at least one more book, and after that, who knows? I'm open to anything, but I think the amount of reading and the kind of content that I was encountering and the ideas and everything. And it's not a super long, this book itself is not a super long book.
Hmm.
And so I feel drawn to follow on this genre for at least one more and then to broaden out.
Kai Thomas, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure. I really enjoyed your questions and this conversation.
I have been speaking with Kai Thomas, author of the brilliant new novel, In the Upper Country. Find it and all the books we talked about at kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. Make sure to catch every conversation by subscribing wherever you listen. Kobo in Conversation is produced, edited, and occasionally hosted by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.